So that's some of the material at the beginning of the book. And a lot of what the book is dealing with is ways to approach magic in a simplified manner where you can take this idea of being prepared for your magical experience, and you can take the experience itself and augment them through using magical means of preparation in addition to more traditional means of preparation. And when I say that, what I mean is looking at techniques that we use in magic to purify ourselves, techniques we use in magic to empower ourselves, to protect ourselves, to strengthen ourselves, and using those as means for preparing for ritual conjuration, as opposed to simply using processes of abstention, of prayer, of waiting in order to prepare. There's definitely value in those methods as well, but sometimes we don't have weeks of time in order to get ourselves prepared. Sometimes our situations are not going to allow us to abstain from some of the things that we would need to abstain for, but we still have some reason why we need to do magic in a certain time frame. And so this gives us options to work around some of those things while also using a method of conjuration that adds components in order to increase our likelihood of success and the potency of the experience. Now, as far as the kind of small class to go along with what we're presenting today, I'm going to talk about preparedness more deeply for that. And when we talk about preparedness, in my mind, there are three main things that we're dealing with. There are three main goals or objects that we want from our process of preparation. And those are essentially the removal of miasma, an obtention of focus, and a sort of charism or spiritual fire or power that is the palpable force of authority that allows us to command spirits, but also to perceive the spirit world. Now, when we look at traditional means of preparing for conjuration, typically what's going to be involved in that, there will be processes of ritual bathing, abstentions from alcohol, abstentions from sex, abstentions from meat and certain foods. And when we look at contemporary writers addressing that, they try to find lots of reasons to explain why those things are important. And generally, one of the ones that's become popular is that we're trying not to offend the spirits with our bodily natures. So by avoiding meat and beans and foods that could produce stronger scents in our sweat or could cause flatulence, then we're avoiding creating scents that the spirits won't like. By avoiding alcohol, by avoiding sex, then we're limiting ourselves from being in bodily states where we are more likely to have elements on ourselves that could create sense or could create perceptive qualities that the spirits will dislike. And I've always thought that that was sort of a weak argument. If you look at the sorts of text describing interactions with angels and describing interactions with spirits that treat spirits as having a disdain for humanity or a distaste for the physical human condition, then that carries through even to the most pure and most spiritually clean humans that they can be presented with. One to use is in the Enochic literature. Enoch is the purest and most spiritually right human being in the world, perhaps through history to that point and going forward after him. He's so pure that God chooses him before the angels, brings him to heaven, and makes him into Metatron, the being who sits basically second in command in heaven after God. And even Enoch, when he enters into heaven, the angels speak of him as having the scent of a white drop or smelling like semen, that he's essentially still made from human seed and is still impure, and they can still smell that impurity on him. So it definitely fits in with this idea that maybe there is some scent component to why we need spiritual purity. But if we look at it, it doesn't matter how pure you are, there's still going to be that sense that you're still human, you're still bodily, and that is something that is offensive to the angels and spirits. So with that being the case, no amount of avoiding certain foods, no amount of avoiding alcohol or sex or anything else is going to adjust that. So there need to be other reasons for that need for spiritual purity. Sharif, did you have a question or an interjection?
Yeah, what I wanted to, I guess it's more of a question, kind of like a line of inquiry. I'm just thinking about what the scent of smell does to me, like how it creates an immediate state change. Like if I smell something that reminds me of someone, I can't be in the present moment because everything about me just got hijacked by that smell. You know what I mean? Unintentionally. So I'm wondering if that dynamic is like in your interactions with spirits, is that your experience? Like the scent of smell is equally as powerful to them as it is for us, because it could literally take them out of the present moment. And given that they don't have a body, there's so much energy that's already generated and sort of expended to even get them to show up, that anything that could interrupt that interaction in the moment is it's like this is what we're preparing ourselves for to prevent. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of looking at it more from like a mechanical, like functional perspective, if that makes sense.
Yep. In my experience, it hasn't really played out that way. I think that it has more to do with us, and that we can be pulled out of that state based on those physical impacts and those things that may distract us. And that's kind of where we'll get into that removal of miasma. For spirits,
Okay.
again, with them not being bodily, they don't have substance in a physical sense. And so their ability to interact with olfactory stimuli is probably a little bit questionable. If we think about the use of incense with spirits, we translate that incense from a purely physical state to a somewhat spiritually engaged state by burning it. A lot of things that we give to spirits, they're things where there's a potential that burning them is a way to transition them to that spiritual state, and that's true of the incenses as well. It's not enough to sit potpourri on an altar and let the smell of that potpourri be enough of an offering for the spirit typically. Now, if we look at ideas around alcohol, that giving offerings of alcohol, we don't have to burn the alcohol because the alcohol already exists in a state that's between two states through its tendency to evaporate.
Right.
Then me being in that kind of tenuous state in the air is enough that it communicates the item to a spirit, and therefore smells could have some impact. But I have never noticed something where there's been something in the environment that's been so egregious that spirits are like, we can't communicate with you, we can't deal with you right now. There may be certain acts or behaviors that occur in an interaction that causes that sort of response from a spirit, but I've never noticed something that's purely environmental doing it. Whereas for us, that can be a big impact. And
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's really, really clear.
no problem. So when we're looking at what the potential reason for a lot of these purifications is, again, I find that these traditional purifications can be useful, again, in the sense of those three goals that I mentioned of removing miasma, shifting focus or awareness, and building spiritual fire or spiritual power.
Yeah. And Elise had a question.
Oh, thank you, Sharif.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay on this microphone?
Yep.
Okay. My question is about the word that you used, charism, because I'm only familiar with the term charisma. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
They are related terms, and they're from the same root. Charism is a term that's used ecclesiastically to refer to essentially gifts of the spirit, or kind of, it can be something similar to the idea of true will in Thelema, where it has to do with your nature and purpose and where you're driven in a spirit sense or spiritual sense. But it can also relate to the actual presence of that spiritual power and spiritual elevation that comes from doing the things that you're called to do and using the inborn spiritual talents that you have. And so I frequently use it in a general sense of spiritual power and presence, which, when we look at the related term of charisma, is sort of like an outward physical reflection of that, that it's the ability to draw things in and influence things based on the power of your presence and the power of your nature. Aman, did you have a question also?
Yes. Hey, thanks. First of all, congratulations on your second book.
Thank you.
And I've got it. I will read it this week. Question is, how do you link this to living spirits? As in, I did read Living Spirits. It was very interesting. It wasn't very practical in the sense of, having a praxis, but is this the praxis for living spirits you see, or is it a, different set of things?
It's not intended specifically as a follow-up or practical manual for working the ideas in living spirits. I am actually working on a text that will be a much more detailed step-by-step version of that, like using all the ideas in living spirits to build up a full sorcery practice. This is seated within that worldview. And so kind of the ideas and the structure that are talked about in living spirits are definitely the ideas and the structure that are the basis for this text. But this text is dealing with sort of a limited range of that. It's specifically addressing conjuring the angels and conjuring the aerial spirits. It can be adapted for conjuring other spirits, but it's not going through a whole, this is how you build up a practice from the ground up with connecting with nature spirits, working with the fairies, working with necromancy, working with everything that's out there and making it one contiguous thing. This deals with ancestor work as a context, and you kind of work with the ancestors and your holy guardian angel, and you call upon some of the titanic forces of nature, and then that builds a context in which you can conjure angels and aerial spirits and potentially conjure demons as well. So it's seated within the worldview and the ideological structure that's presented in living spirits, but it's not like a working manual for how to build up all of those ideas into a practical set. But definitely, if people have read living spirits, then it will provide the sort of intellectual foundation for what's talked about in Luminarium.
Wonderful, thank you. But is it like kind of arbitral, or is it, Solomonic, or is it a blend of various things? What do you say?
It's a blend of a few different things. It's not precisely Solomonic in the sense that it doesn't use all of the different steps that are used in Solomonic evocation, and the structure for the tools is a little bit different, but it's not altogether foreign from the ideas that a Solomonic magician will be familiar with. It does go through the process of divine invocation. It has the process of invoking the spirit and it has a particular space in which the spirit is to manifest, you could go through a step of binding the spirit, should you choose to, and then of course the spirit is licensed to depart at the end. So it's got some very similar hallmarks to the hallmarks of Solomonic conjuration, but is not precisely the same. It uses elements from the magical papyri, elements drawn from Orphism, and then for its main conjuration component, it uses the heptameron. So,
Okay, thank you. Yeah, yeah.
all right, so back to preparation. So when we look at these ideas of abstaining from different things, these are ways in which we can accomplish the removal of miasma. We can accomplish a shift in focus, and we can start to build and stimulate that spiritual fire or spiritual power. Now, when we talk about the removal of miasma, miasma gets back to that idea of things which pull us out of the conjuration experience, or things which pull us out of the religious or the spiritual or the magical experience. When we go to engage some sort of religious experience or spiritual experience, but we're worried about bills that are coming through, or we're worried about something we said to someone earlier in the day that may have created a problem or caused them to be offended. We're worried about whether or not we're worthy because of our behaviors. Those are things that are going to make it more difficult for us to engage in work with spirits. And that's not necessarily because the spirits are sitting there watching everything we're doing and judging us. Depending on the type of spirit we're working with, they may or may not be paying attention to anything we're doing outside of the conjuration. Some spirits might have a little bit more attentiveness to things like that, but others won't. It has a lot more to do with us and our perceptions and our experience. When we try to work with spirits, we're working on perceiving things that are existing on a level and of a nature that is not the way that we're hardwired to deal with things in our regular daily experience. And really, when I say we're not hardwired to deal with it that way, I should kind of scale that back a little bit. I think it is something that's natural to humans to be able to interact with the spirit world and interact with spirits. But the way that we're conditioned through our context, it's not something that is part of our average experience and sort of average toolkit for our normal daily waking interactions. And so it can be easy to throw things off as we try to shift ourselves into that awareness. And I think anyone who's worked with spirits, anyone who's worked with conjuration can attest to that, that there are things we do in the ritual that work to pull us into a space where our focus and attention is in a place where we can comprehend the experience of the spirit world, where we can perceive spirits, where we can recognize the stimuli that the spirits provide to us and interpret some sort of perception from that. But it's also something where we can be pulled out from that if there's something significant that comes along and distracts us, and it can be hard to get back into that space once there's a distraction. So if we're going into it with a bunch of mental distractions or a bunch of things that make us feel like we aren't going to be able to do it, or we aren't going to be able to get some sort of response or perceive the response, or things where our mind is just completely elsewhere, then it's a lot harder to build that focus that's needed, because we're going to be scattered in multiple different places. And so removing that miasma, removing all of those concerns, those ideas that make us feel like we can't be present in the moment, is an important part of spiritual preparation. So if we go through a process where we're isolating ourselves for several days beforehand, then yeah, that isolation is going to make it such that we don't have the opportunity to say something which we're concerned about having offended someone. We don't have the opportunity to think about different material things that we're going to have to be dealing with. We don't have the opportunity to behave in a way that we perceive as being impure or being something the spirits may be against. And so isolating things like that are ways in which we can kind of avoid the accumulation of miasma. Going through processes like spiritual baths, going through confession, attending masses, praying the Psalms, things along those lines, those are ways in which we can mitigate that sense of miasma. We can start to believe that we're pulling ourselves back into a state of spiritual purity. We can kind of wash away the attention, wash away whatever stain we believe is on ourselves from those acts which we might perceive as making ourselves spiritually impure. And so we're putting ourselves in a state where we're more comfortable and we're more able to focus on what's happening. There are lots of things that we can do in order to achieve that. So simple rituals where we deal with physical cleanliness in order to symbolically wash away what's happening are rituals that can recenter us and make ourselves ready to engage those experiences. Again, going through and abstaining from things can help us put ourselves into a space where we recognize that we are spiritually capable and we are spiritually able, and we're able to go into those rituals without that distraction. There's a lot of different things that we can explore for the potential for removing that miasma, but the simplest ones are ones that are acts of becoming ritually clean and going through processes to clean ourselves with a special mindfulness around what we're doing. In dealing with miasma, though, there is also the reality that there are actions and there are things that can spiritually impact us beyond simply our attentiveness or our awareness of our spiritual preparation. Sometimes there are things which attach to us because we've been in places that have spiritual forces associated with them that could be detrimental to the work we're doing or counterproductive to the work we're doing. Sometimes there are things that attach to us because someone looks at us with jealousy or covetousness and kind of engages, whether intentionally or not, the evil eye or some other sort of negative influence or evil influence that they pass on to us. Sometimes we perceive our own actions in such a way that we draw negative forces to ourselves or attach negative spiritual presences to ourselves because of the way that we engage things that we've done, or simply because maybe things we've done are things that do connect to those spiritual forces. And so sometimes there is a reality to needing to clean those things off. And so again, processes of prayer, processes of ritual bathing can be ways to remove that. Now, we've talked a little bit about, okay, there's another question here. Okay, that's a pretty good question. How would this work be different from someone who is not of Judeo-Christian faith? One assumes that this sort of spirit work took place prior to the earliest grimoires in Greek antiquity and Egypt. Are there tips you can offer on adaptations and accommodations? Do the spirits, angels, demons, etc., respond differently to people of non-Judeo-Christian faiths? So there's a lot there. As far as how is this different for someone from a non-Judeo-Christian faith, I don't think that there's going to be a significant difference in the concepts. In fact, I think a lot of where I'm drawing my interpretation of these concepts is kind of influenced on Greek faith or Hellenism. It's just going to be a matter of what sorts of prayers you use, what sorts of deities you turn to, how you consecrate the material that you're using in order to cleanse yourself in that case. There may also be some difference in terms of what acts create that sort of mental barrier for you. As far as what acts create actual real spiritual impact, those are probably going to be the same regardless of your faith, because that has more to do with whether or not you're engaging something where you're coming into contact with a spiritual force that may be counterproductive to what you're doing. And that's going to be less about what your individual faith is and just more about what the presence or the powers are involved in a particular situation. As far as the actual acts to cleanse yourself, a ritual bath is a ritual bath, regardless of your spiritual background. If you look historically, there may be some differences in how that's affected. So like from a Roman perspective, instead of bathing in a tub of water, then you might rub yourself down with scented oils and then scrub or scrape those oils off from yourself. But it's still the same idea that you are still trying to remove things and become clean. Now, if you're doing it ritually, there's going to be, again, a certain mindfulness that you're attaching to it, and also prayer processes. So if in a Judeo-Christian context, you're praying using the Psalms, maybe in a Greek or Roman context, you might make a prayer to Hygieia for a return of spiritual health and completeness in that, or to Asclepius or to Apollo. So the deities or the spirits that have to do with healing, that have to do with cleanliness, that have to do with completion of things, those are the ones that you would turn to in that case. So it's the same ideas, the same processes, but not necessarily the same specific prayers that you would use. That's going to be the big difference between Jewish or a Christian perspective versus some sort of pagan perspective. As far as whether or not the spirits respond differently, I have not found that to be the case. When I first began working in spirit conjuration, I still worked in a Judeo-Christian context as far as the types of ritual practices I was using, but my religious ideology and affiliation was definitely very traditional pagan at the time. Now I have kind of a religious view that encompasses both a pagan worldview and a Catholic Christian worldview, and so I haven't noticed anything particularly different as far as how the spirits are going to respond to that, or the types of things that the spirits expect, or what their recommendations or behaviors are. Excuse me. What I have found is that by being able to engage more earnestly from a Judeo-Christian perspective, that some of the processes for ritual and some of the interactions with the spirits, I'm able to engage them differently and get something out of them differently than I would have without that perspective. And that's not on the spirit's end. That's definitely something that's more on my end. There's also a question wondering if the Psalms are King James Version or a different one. The Psalms presented in Luminarium are King James Version. And part of that is I find the King James Version is the language used in it tends to be nice for ritual. It fits with kind of the sort of flowery language that we expect in a ritual context. I also they're not the ones that I would pick if I were doing like biblical research. There's much better Bibles for that. But as far as something to reprint in a book, King James Version stuff is what, 500 years old, 400 years old, so easily in the public domain. So it's probably the easiest one to use in that kind of book context. I think Sharif, did you have another?
Yeah, I do, man. I'm sorry, man. I don't want to hog up all the time. This might be a diversion, but I'm wanting to know I'm wanting to know like if you've established any sort of spirit contact within like a thelemic paradigm. And I'm mostly asking because I'm very eager to dive into the book that you just released. But my foundational, I guess, worldview and like the I guess like operating worldview that I come from is thelema. And one of the things that I grapple with is I get so much more spirit contact and spirit interaction from outside of that worldview and paradigm. So I kind of want to know if like some of the stuff that you've come up with has yielded authentic spirit contact within within a specifically thelemic paradigm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, well, to clarify, do you mean ritual approaches using a thelemic paradigm, or do you mean spirit communication where the spirits are reflecting a thelemic paradigm?
Yeah, spirit communication with the spirits reflecting a thelemic paradigm.
Okay. Not specifically so. I think a lot of thelema really fits in with kind of there's a lot of thelema that if you strip it down, like if you were to kind of boil it out and take like the essence of it, like put it through like an alchemical process, then the sort of essential components that you'd be pulling out are all components that exist in earlier Western tradition. And I feel like a lot of thelema is a good way of introducing those ideas and is a springboard from which people can go explore them in deeper contexts and explore them in kind of like the original source material and dive a lot deeper into what's going on with them. So there are definitely things where in interacting with spirits, I can see where the recommendations that they give or the information they give is not contrary to the ideas that someone would hold as a thelemite, and could fit in with the ideas that someone would have as a thelemite, but very much in the way that they would fit in with ideas of someone exploring Hermeticism and Platonism and kind of the general arc that is spirituality through the Western consciousness.
Understood.
And I think like if you look, there's a project I used to kind of toy with of putting together quotations from various earlier religious sources and spiritual and philosophical sources, and showing how thelemic ideas reflected throughout history, and there's nothing really new to it. I think when you're looking at spirit experience and comparing them, then
hang on, BJ. I'm gonna tell Max to mute himself real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. But I was tracking you up until that point.
Yeah.
Which the difference that just so you know, the difference that made for me is that it helped me to see that there are like within like thelema itself, there are principles that are, you know, we can say that they're kind of universal. They'll just show up in a different language and context outside of thelema, but it doesn't necessarily mean that outside of thelema they don't exist. They're just arising in a different kind of context and being spoken of in a different way. But you know, if you can easily map that principle, or you can find that the way that principle expresses itself within thelemic language, and therefore thelemic magic, if you have like the eyes to look for it or you have the ears to listen for it.
Yep, no, I think that's very true.
Yeah.
In terms of well, not the question itself, but the approaching from a thelemic ritual perspective, I have done some experimentation with spirit conjuration using thelemic ritual components and using kind of more material that is suited to a thelemic background. And I've done that in group settings with other people. The experience has generally been that it works, but that the spirits start responding when we get to the traditional components. That, like, when we're doing like the Crowley poetry and all, that there's not, the spirit might be present the way that the spirit kind of is present at the beginning of a conjuration before you go through all the calls. But multiple people sort of have experienced that it doesn't seem like it cares as much about what's happening and isn't as
Understood.
interested in what's happening until you get to using the divine names and traditional prayers and stuff, and then it's like, then it's there.
Wow. That's great. That's really, I don't know, there's something about that that's like, it's kind of rocking me a little bit, you know what I mean? It's rocking me, but at the same time, it's to be expected, you know? But I get it, man. Thanks for answering the question. That was really, really clear.
No problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were getting to sort of moving from the idea of miasma to the idea of building focus. And I think for me, the big moment of understanding the importance of focus and awareness from spiritual preparations was in talking with people about the Abramelin working. At a bar once with some friends who had also done the Abramelin, and in discussing it, I had said that the only time that I've ever experienced anything nearly as visceral and physically real and potent as the experience of the Holy Guardian Angel at the end of the Abramelin working was as a teenager doing journeying. And with that journeying work, doing things like fasting, staying awake for days at a time, doing stone drumming, things where they were all things that were going to set the body into a very different state by kind of pushing the body to certain kinds of limits. And through pushing the body to those limits, it creates a different sort of state of awareness. And I feel that a lot of the spiritual preparations that the grimoires recommend, that's one of the elements of what they're doing, is they're putting us into a state of being somewhat separate so that we are forcing our focus in a given direction. We're forcing our focus on the divine. We're forcing our focus on spirits and on the spirit world. And we are not just focusing in that direction, but we're doing so in a way where it's going to change the way that our bodies are working, because we're denying things from ourselves. We're putting ourselves into a different set of behaviors, a different set of experiences than we're used to having. And so our awareness is going to shift as our focus shifts. And so it's setting us up to be more capable of perceiving the spirit world, both by changing the way our awareness works and by honing our focus in that direction. And that's one where it doesn't have a lot to kind of add to it, as far as like with miasma, looking at what the causes of miasma are, what the effects of miasma are, and how we remove it. Focus is pretty straightforward. If we are paying to a thing, we're going to see more details of that thing. We're going to get more out of what we perceive when we look at that thing. The more we're able to hone our attention in on that thing to the exclusion of all else. And the same is going to be true as far as our interaction with spirits and our interaction with the spirit world. The more we're able to shift our focus out of the physical attention of the day-to-day world and onto those things that are spiritual and those things that are divine, the more we're going to be able to perceive them, the more we're going to be able to experience the details and the depths of those perceptions. As far as changing our state of awareness, I remember when I was younger and first reading books on magic, they talk sometimes about the power of meditation, and that just closing your eyes for a moment could change which brain waves were the dominant type of brain waves being used, and that different things that we do physically will change the way that we're physically aware. Anyone who has stayed up awake for a day or two at a time can attest to that, that the way that they perceive things, the way that their mind works is going to be different. People who have used drugs or alcohol, people who have engaged in physically demanding activities for long periods of time, anything that we're doing that sets our body into a different sort of balance than what it's used to is going to change how we perceive things and how our senses work, how our perceptions work, and essentially how our brain is processing all those things around us. And so when we engage in systems of spiritual preparation, it's an opportunity to do that. It's an opportunity to change the way that our bodies are interacting with the world and interacting with things around us, so that we enter a state in which we will have a differentiated awareness. So there's another question in the chat. Will your new book be of use in attaining into knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel? Not specifically, no. The Holy Guardian Angel is used very significantly in the conjuration practice that the book presents. There is a system of conjuring a divine light through the use of a lamp, and that is tied to the Holy Guardian Angel in the method that's being used here. And so you will be very directly engaging your angel. And the nature of that engagement is such that the angel is a spiritual presence that should be more familiar and more natural to you. And so you can understand the experience and interaction with the angel more readily than with other angels and demons and spirits that you may interact with. The angel also has the ability to illuminate your awareness and stimulate your spiritual sensation, and kind of provide that spiritual power that we're about to talk about. And so by conjuring the angel, or not really conjuring, but calling upon the angel through the use of the ritual involving the lamp in this process, you're illuminating your spiritual senses, and you're allowing the angel to be there to help translate the stimuli from whatever spirit you're calling upon, so that as your spiritual body receives that stimulus and translates that to your mental processes, your angel is there to help kind of refine that process of receiving it, so that you're able to perceive it more easily and more vividly, and in a way that's clearer for you to understand. So you will be working with your angel in a routine and ongoing way through using this. And so ultimately that can help with attaining knowledge and conversation. But it's not, the book's not presenting a process for that. In my previous book, Living Spirits, there were 3 or 4 rituals for working with the Holy Guardian Angel that I considered putting in, and after talking with some people, determined that it wasn't really the focus of the book, and that it would have kind of thrown things off, so not to include them. So I am working on a text currently which presents those, as well as additional material on the Holy Guardian Angel, and talks in depth about the process of achieving knowledge and conversation, both through using the method described in the Abramelin, as well as sort of through modified idiosyncratic methods. So that's hopefully something that I'll have out within the next year or so. But it's been a bit of a slower process than I expected, because there's a lot to say about the Holy Guardian Angel. It's a pretty in-depth topic. All right, so on the, and I guess the Holy Guardian Angel is a good transition into the idea of sort of spiritual fire or spiritual power and authority. And that's one where sometimes when I talk about that, people kind of wonder what it is that I mean. And when I say that preparations help us build charism or build spiritual fire or build authority and presence. And when you go through certain types of ritual approaches to conjuring spirits, there is going to be points where you are engaging in a kind of calling on divine force in the mode of the Holy Spirit, or calling on divine force in a sort of personalized nature, which helps give you the authority to call upon and command the spirits, and also helps give you the visionary capacity in order to perceive the spirits. And that's something that if we look back even to the Testament of Solomon, Solomon prays, and God sends the Archangel Michael to Solomon with a magical ring, and through receiving the Archangel and the grace that goes with the presence of the Archangel and receiving the ring as a sign of that grace, then Solomon is able to call upon and command the spirits and interact with them, where he didn't have the capability to do that prior. And until he calls upon Michael, he's unsure of what to do in order to deal with the situation of a spirit vexing someone in his court. So lots of different systems involve this idea of some sort of transmission of power, or some sort of innate power, or some sort of power that's called upon by the magician that allows them to work with the spirit world. We can see systems where the idea of building this power through meditation, through spiritual training, through certain ritual activities, creates sort of an illuminating fire in the magician and opens the magician up to certain psychic awarenesses and spiritual powers that allow the magician to interact with the spirit world. So when we look at some of these modern systems that are drawing from Eastern systems, and they talk about the idea of gaining spiritual powers as a side effect of the meditations, as a side effect of the ritual work, this is kind of along the idea of what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual power, that through engaging in certain types of preparations and certain types of ways of manipulating your experience, you create a state that stimulates that divine presence, that stimulates that divine authority that is partially innate to you as a spiritual being and is partially drawn on from the spiritual interactions and religious interactions that you cultivate. Now, when we look at the preparations in the grimoire system, again, we're looking at things where you're engaging in prayers, you're attending religious rituals, you are removing from yourself things that are temptations and distractions and vices in that particular spiritual system. Even if we take out the sort of Christian worldview from it, if we say that we're going to take the next 3 weeks and we're going to disallow sex, masturbation, pornography, alcohol, meat, dessert items, going out and engaging in pleasurable recreational activities, anything that could potentially be something that is a pleasing or a sensuous kind of stimulus for ourselves, then we're putting ourselves into a state where, again, we're shifting that focus and we're putting our focus into the spiritual things we're doing, because as we abstain from those things, we're going to add in things like praying the Psalms, going to Mass, saying prayers to the Holy Guardian Angel or to the Holy Spirit or to whatever spiritual power it is that you're sort of approaching as the source of aid and authority in your spiritual work. But at the same time that we're shifting our focus onto those spiritual things, our bodily focus and our natural focus is going to be on all of those things that we're denying ourselves. and all of those things that we're saying we can't have. And so there's an element that's sort of counterintuitive there. If we don't want to be distracted by our desire for sex, our desire for meat, or our desire for alcohol, or whatever else it is that we're abstaining from, isn't it easier to not be distracted from those desires if we engage them, if we allow ourselves to have those things so that we kind of scratch that itch and satisfy it? And there may be some truth to that, but there's also the idea that the more we engage in those things, the more we allow ourselves to have those things, the more those things become what we're focusing on. And we don't become satisfied, we just want them more. So if we're going to take an approach of abstaining from them, we have to take an approach where we abstain long enough that we don't have that initial, oh, I really want this thing that I'm not allowing myself to have. We have to get to a point where we've become comfortable with abstaining from that so that we can then be focused on what it is that we are trying to focus on. Excuse me. And even for people who haven't gone through those sort of processes of spiritual abstention and purification, if you've ever, again, stayed awake for way longer than is normal, or if you've ever fasted for a long period, you get to a point where you get really tired or you get really hungry, and all you really want to do is go to sleep, or all you really want to do is eat. And then you get past that point where you go back to a sort of equilibrium, normal state where you don't feel as hungry anymore, you don't feel as tired anymore, you're able to function. But once you crest through that, then there's still a bit of a difference in sort of what your experience is and how you're approaching things and how you're thinking about things. You're able to function, but you are still functioning somewhat differently. And that's kind of the same thing as you're going through these major abstentions. You need to get to a point where you're able to function without preoccupation, but you're at a point where you're functioning differently. There's a question of, could it also be considered as a form of sacrifice? Yes. And I think that gets to the idea, if we're interpreting spiritual purity as kind of a because God said so sort of thing, as opposed to a mechanical thing, then the idea of giving up all these things which are pleasurable, or giving up all these things that we might desire because we're told to do it, becomes an act of devotion. And it becomes something where we say that this divine force that we're calling upon for aid in our spiritual work or our magical work, or these spirits that we're going to be calling upon, that they are important enough that we are willing to give up these things for them in order to do what it is that they want us to do. Alternatively, you could also look at it as sort of dedication. So along the lines of, like, say, if you're creating a piece of art and you dedicate the work of creating that art and the result and pleasure of that art to a god or a saint or to some sort of spirit, then similarly, if you say, I'm going to fast and I'm going to dedicate the time that I'm spending fasting to this god or this saint or this spirit, then that can be a meaningful way of approaching it, as far as a devotional practice for gaining their aid and gaining their presence to help you work with those spirits, particularly if you're working with some sort of god or saint who went through something similar. So if, say, you're working with Catholic saints, then fasting as a devotional element to do something that's the same as what the saint did can be meaningful. Or if you're working with like Hestia or Athena or Artemis, and saying, I'm going to abstain from sexual contact in order to bring myself into line with these virgin goddesses, so that I will be likened unto them and they will be more willing to help me. That can be a meaningful devotional practice as well that can aid in this type of work. To go back to the idea of generating spiritual power, again, we've noted that by abstaining, you're going to create an initial preoccupation with those things you're abstaining from, but at the same time, you're engaging in spiritual, reflective, and meditative and ritual practices that are trying to push your focus into a preoccupation on that divinity. And basically what you're doing is you're creating a divided state in which you have polarized yourself. And that polarization can create kind of an internal agitation where you are desiring one thing, but you're trying to pull towards another thing. And that desire is like a constant itch or like a clawing finger pushing at you or scraping at you, trying to get you into a state where you go ahead and have the thing that you're trying to pull away from. And so it creates sort of a friction or a movement internally in your being and in your experience. And that friction or movement is a way of generating that sort of spiritual force. I like to think of it as a capacitance, although it's a little bit different than the way capacitance works, but not completely different. It's somewhat similar to having two sort of magnetically charged polar forces generating a field inside yourself. And the more that you agitate each of those forces, the more that you stir up the movement in the direction of the spiritual, and the more that you create movement in the direction of the bodily, the more you are creating a heightened, more dramatic, more dynamic friction that creates more of sort of an internal spiritual electricity that you're able to use and channel to open yourself up. And there's got to be a component of focusing and honing how that energy works so you don't just sort of spin out into distraction. But as you go through that state, the more you're working those things, you'll start to perceive that naturally. And as you're focusing in on the spiritual, you can kind of take that energy that you're creating through that capacitance and focus it on those spiritual ends so that it becomes something that's illuminating and opens you up by opening up whatever centers or whatever components you have that allow you to have that spiritual vision. It also becomes the power that is then used to assert your authority and assert sort of your magnetism and presence when calling upon spirits. So when we deal with the spirit world, I talk a lot about sort of leverage based on having alliances and relationships with spirits and working with those spirits to help you work with the spirits that you're ultimately trying to call for stuff. So calling upon your ancestors or calling upon your household spirits or upon local nature spirits so that you have kind of friends that are there that are in that spirit world that you're not directly in yourself, so that they can help kind of navigate and impact what's happening in the spirit world for you. Another end of the ability to impact the spirit world is having power in the spirit world, having power that you can kind of present and show that you have a force to impact things and to affect things on that level in the spirit world. And this is a way of generating that power. And that's kind of the main sort of crux of the idea of this charism or this spiritual fire, is that you're creating a fire in yourself that is able to, again, allow you to see more clearly, but also able to give you the authority and presence of command. And that's something that we can see in our normal lives as well. When we look at charisma and presence and people who have developed a certain power and authority by balancing themselves in a certain way, or presenting themselves in a certain way, or developing a certain sort of gravitas, then there's a greater ability to impact people, not necessarily through authority, not necessarily through having power delegated by a structure or by an institution, not necessarily because they have alliance with other people who have power or authority, but because their very presence is one that is commanding and one which calls people to want to listen to it and to do what it is that they're saying. It's something that's inspiring, and so that's part of what you're going for in developing that spiritual fire and working with the spirit world. So there was a comment that it feels very yogic in terms of the type of practice, and it definitely is. My experience of yoga is from the AA program, and anyone who's really looked at that, it's its own thing. It's its own system. It's not really yoga in a traditional sense in the cultural context from which yoga comes. And I don't have experience with yoga in an Indian context. I don't have experience with Tantra, so I don't want to speak to those practices or claim that this is the same or similar to those practices. But I will say that definitely in hearing people who have backgrounds with those practices talk about them, it definitely feels like there are points of comparison and points of similarity, even if they're not precisely the same thing. There's also a note that it's reminiscent of alchemy. Yes, very much so. Alchemy is one where I feel like more comfortable speaking on that. There are definitely points in alchemy where the changes that are happening are similar to the changes here, sort of changes of agitation and breaking things down and juxtaposing things, creating the sort of internal fires for spiritual change. It's very much the same thing. Then there's one. Does the book have clear instructions to adapt the method to use for beings from the Goetia and the Verum? The book does not go in depth in terms of specifically adapting for work with demons, but in one of the there's 4 accounts at the end of the book that talk about people's experience working with the system provided in the book, so that people are able to kind of compare and see that this is something that people were able to work and how they adjusted things, what kinds of experiences they had. One of the 4 accounts does include somebody adapting it to conjure a demon from the Goetia, and I believe in that account I do talk a little bit about how to make that kind of adjustment. The model that was used for setting up the ritual structure presented in the book, the original time that I worked with this structure and approach was a little bit different than what's presented in the book, because the first time out was for a public ritual, and so there were parts that were adjusted so that people could participate in it, and that it was sort of more visible stuff happening for working in a public context. But it used the same basic ritual structure and the same components, and had additional components for working for conjuring demons. Essentially, for doing that, after you conjure the angel, you would ask the angel for help with calling upon and controlling the demon that's being called. Then you would do a call for whichever king the demon is under, so that you can call upon the king to aid you in allowing access to the demon and controlling the way that the demon manifests and works for you. And then you would use a conjuration to call upon the demon. So you could use the conjuration from the Heptameron or the Goetia, which they're basically the same. You could potentially use one from the Verum. You might have some different adaptations if you're working with the Verum, since the demons there work under the chiefs instead of under the kings, but it would be the same sort of idea. So it's very easy to adapt the system to that kind of work. You just need a couple extra steps. So, okay, so that pretty much goes over kind of the 3 main ideas around being prepared, like what the preparations provide to us and how those things work. Were there other questions people wanted to ask? Okay, spirits to be conjured to a visible manifestation in order to achieve tangible results. So one of the questions sent was, do spirits have to be conjured to visible manifestation in order to achieve tangible results? No. commented many times and have found it very curious that a lot of people working publicly in spirit conjuration focus on the idea of visible appearance, but you very rarely ever hear those same people talk about actual results they get from conjuring the spirit. They'll kind of present that they did everything exactly the way that the book says to do it, and so the spirit appeared visibly, and they'll sort of make a big deal about how objective the visible appearance is, although the spirit's typically still appearing in a scrying device seen by a scryer. And that's the extent of what they talk about as a measure of success. To me, the measure of success is much more whether or not you ask the spirit for something and the spirit does the thing you ask for, or the spirit provides you information and you're able to go and verify that information separately, or it gives you information, and if it's information about a situation, you're able to use that information to solve the situation, and it's information that you did not have yourself already. Those are things that are much more objective measures of whether or not the spirit was really present and whether or not you were successful. And to achieve those things, no, the spirit doesn't have to be physically present. Well, the spirit doesn't have to be physically visible. The spirit has to be present. So as far as spiritual presence, that can be something that's experienced in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it'll be something as simple as having a sense that there's something in the room with you, something watching you, something interacting with you. Sometimes it will be a visible presence in the scrying device or a visible presence physically. Sometimes it'll be a change in the physical perceptions of the room. Sometimes it'll be noises or things that move on their own. There's lots of different ways that that can occur depending on the nature of the spirit and the means of the conjuration. I find that the conjuration method often has a big impact on that. And with the spirits being conjured here, we're dealing with archangels and with aerial spirits. Those are spirits that normally you would not try to bind to physical appearance. In fact, the Ars Rabid Madar even says that the aerial spirits don't appear physically. They're just there so that you can hear them and perceive them, but that they're not going to create a visible appearance. Whereas spirits like the more chthonic and the infernal spirits are more likely to be bound to a physical appearance. There's a question, do I ever come to DC for presentations? If there's an organization that invites me to, then yes. Typically, because I was involved with the OTO Lodge here in Baltimore, I've done stuff there. But if there was a group in DC that wanted to host me for something, then yeah, I would do a presentation in DC. I've done some in Laurel before, but that's probably the closest I've done to DC. Although the very first public occult presentation I did when I was 19 was in Bowie, maybe? So that might be closer to DC than Laurel, but that was a long time ago. Are there daily psalms that you'd recommend to help build that spirit connection? If so, what psalms? I would actually, if you're looking for daily prayers, I would go with either the Orphic hymns or the daily prayers from the Heptameron or the daily prayers from the Hygromanteia, something along those lines rather than the Psalms. And that's actually what the book recommends, is using the Orphic hymns and the prayers from Heptameron. You could also use the ones from the Hygromanteia. The Enchiridion of Pope Leo, that has prayers for the days of the week as well. There's a few different grimoire sources that have prayers for the days of the week, so any of those would work. There's not psalms that I would recommend specific to the days of the week now. The follow-up to that, which version of the Orphic hymns do I recommend? The book presents Thomas Taylor's, again, because those are the ones that are in public domain, so it's easy to use them in publications. I use the ones that were published by Johns Hopkins University Press by, let me just grab it because it's actually right next to me. By Apostolos Athanasakis. So this is the version that I frequently use in personal work if I'm doing just kind of like daily prayers or prayers on their own. If I'm doing something in a ritual context, then I'm probably more likely to use Thomas Taylor's. But yeah, usually those two versions are the versions that I draw from. Patrick Dunn has a translation out that is, as far as I understand it, kind of tailored to use by magicians. And then Sarah Mastros also has a translation out that is tailored to use by magicians. I have not had a chance to check either of those out yet, though. There's another question. Do I still use practices like the lesser rituals, the pentagram and hexagram, and the rose cross? I do not. When I was going through the Abramelin work, in the couple days of doing the confession and wearing the ash, while doing those, I was using the lesser ritual, the pentagram, the lesser ritual, the hexagram, the star ruby, the star sapphire, and the Beresh. And when I got to the end of that period, there was a very clear communication from my angel that those rituals were no longer rituals for me, and that I would be using that process as kind of a way to say goodbye to those rituals. That there would be times where I might use them for a specific purpose, but as far as using them as a daily spiritual practice or a routine developmental practice, that was no longer going to be something that would fit into what I was doing. Other people might have other experiences. I think at least one of my friends who has done it has also mentioned that she kind of didn't do those rituals anymore after that, but it was more less that she had sort of a communication telling her not to, and more just that she didn't feel drawn to do them anymore after that. I think those rituals prior to knowledge and conversation are very useful as spiritual developmental rituals. I often refer to them as magical aerobics, and that kind of sounds like it's belittling them, but it's not intended to. It's in some systems of sports training, you'll refer to activities as aerobic if they are activities that are not necessarily useful in a practical sense, but they're very useful for developing the skill sets and the perceptions and the modes of movement that are needed to do other things in a practical sense. And that's very much what the pentagram and hexagram rituals do, is they kind of develop those faculties and those abilities to move in the way that you need to move for other ritual work. Sharif, did you have another question?
Yeah, just this was more like a comment on the value of prep, because my relationship to prep was like, this is just some shit that I gotta do to have a spirit come. But I never looked at it inside of the context of, if I successfully do everything that there is to do in this prep, I'm giving myself authority. By just the act of abstaining from whatever I would be eating, drinking, sex, whatever. Just the act of abstaining successfully for that period of time. Who's calling that spirit is like, I've already demonstrated that I have mastery. So, what up? I never looked at it like that. You know what I mean? Yep. So I just wanted to comment. I just wanted to comment, like, I have a whole new appreciation and a whole new context for preparation as something that I'm literally giving something to myself, not something that needs to be done in order to. You know what I mean? It's like a rite of passage that I initiate and I complete for my own benefit. And then an additional benefit of that would be however the spirit would be interacting with me, as long as it's like in accordance to what I'm calling it for. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's
a
very good way to understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that.
No problem.
I got a question.
Yes.
Do you recognize any alternative cross-culturally maybe of the Holy Guardian Angel that may be applicable to Luminarium?
Yes, I am not of the view that the Holy Guardian Angel is a singularly occurring concept that is only in conjunction with the Abramelin text. I think that just doesn't make sense at all, that this being would have not existed in magic until that text was written, or that something that's so important and impactful would only be approached through that one particular ritual method. This is just not the way that anything else in magic works, and it sort of seems strange that it wouldn't have been discovered or experienced until someone wrote that book. So I think throughout history there are a lot of other ways of describing that same spirit. I think there's no real difference between the Holy Guardian Angel and the Guardian Angel in Catholicism. I think when we look at the spiritual assistant in the Magical Papyri, then the Magical Papyri presents a few different spiritual assistant concepts. So maybe not all of them are the same as the Holy Guardian Angel, but there are definitely ones that overlap with that. There's a question in the chat. Is context parallel to or the same as the natal angel? I've seen a lot where people specifically try to separate the Holy Guardian Angel from the natal angel. There's also the Guardian Angel described in the Pauline art that is astrological in nature, and people try to say that that is connected to the natal angel, but not to the Holy Guardian Angel, or that that is also an additional separate angel, and that there's this whole host of angels that each person has tied to them as being specifically related to that person. If you look back at Iamblichus in his Initiation of the Mysteries, when he describes the daimon, which essentially is describing the Holy Guardian Angel, he describes it in a somewhat astrological context. It goes beyond simply understanding a specific astrological spirit, though, and more sort of addresses the idea that the overall conditions of everything occurring at the moment of your birth play into the definition of the angel, or the spirit. That all of these different factors and forces that are at play define the nature of this spiritual being that is attached to you and oversees you and guides and directs you, and that has to do with overall what the character and nature of your life is going to be. So in my view, that would mean that the natal angel or the nativity angel, that's the same thing. Now, that's me assessing it from the perspective of looking at the textual material and looking at what they say about what the spirits do. I have not gone and done specific nativity angel work in order to compare them in a practical sense. But my interpretation is, yeah, based on Iamblichus, probably the same thing. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys, or thank you everyone for being here and for showing support for the book. I really appreciate it. For people who weren't able to attend, we've got this recorded, so I will put together the audio from it. I'm not going to put up the video because different people's images are on there. But the audio will be made available for people that want to give it a listen again, in case there's stuff that you kind of want to review from it, or for people who weren't able to make it. So, all right. Well,
Awesome. Thank you so much, DJ. This is really great. Thank you, man. Thank you for all your hard work and everything that you contribute to the community, and you know, the larger magical discourse that you add to for us practitioners. It's like super greatly appreciated, man.
Thank you so much.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Nice, DJ.
All right, I'm going to shut everything down now then.
Thanks.
Have a great day, everybody.